1944, Normandy. The church smelled of wet straw and iron, shadows pooled under the pews where blankets lay like quiet bodies. A hand turned the crank of a small lantern. Its light wheezed in time with a failing generator and painted the plaster in a tired yellow beat. On a wooden table, a scalpel sat wrapped in gauze, its metal edge catching the light like a promise. Colette's armband was smudged with mud and a dark halo where she had gripped it all night. The pilot breathed through lips cut thin by cold. Every inhale made the bandage at his side whisper. Dr. Arthur leaned over the man, fingers steady, but not without tremor. Outside, someone cursed in the dark, and boots shuffled past the church door. A thin ampule clicked against glass as it was lined up for morphine. Colette pressed a photograph into her palm, then onto the chest of the wounded man as if anchoring him to any human shore left. "He's the enemy," a voice said, low and sharp. "He's a patient," Colette answered. Arthur closed his eyes for half a breath, the scalpel unwrapping in his fingers. He raised it toward the chest, and at that exact moment, a knock came, hard, on the outer door, as if the night itself demanded an account. Mercy where hate was expected. In the pulse of that dim church, the choice ahead of Dr. Arthur and Colette was not theory, but muscle memory and a thinned-out supply kit. To honor the oath and stitch a dying enemy soldier back into life, or to close the gauze and obey orders that would let him slip away. The scene is small, a scalpel, a morphine ampule, a bandage roll, but the consequence is wide. Triage here is not only about who lives next, it is about what a medic will answer when asked which side compassion belongs to. They work in whispers, hands steady, as the world outside measures loyalty in patrols and paper. This is mercy in practice, a quiet defiance that keeps the hospital human when everything else insists on inhuman lines. If stories of courage under oath move you, consider subscribing. July of 1944, in Normandy. The church behind the hedgerows had become one of many makeshift field hospitals pressed into service as armies moved and the wounded piled up. WW2. Arthur Collins arrived with a small British medical detachment. Colette Bernard worked with a network of local nurses and resistance volunteers who kept the place running when supplies ran low. Their role was simple and absolute. Keep the dying man alive long enough for triage, bandage the worst wounds, steady shock with morphine and a steady hand, then move those who could be moved onto stretchers and the next convoy. In practice, it was anything but simple. Shelling came in uneven rhythms, patrols crossed the lanes half blind, and the Red Cross markings on canvas tents did not always guarantee calm at the gate. A medic in that landscape carried two risks at once. There was the clinical risk, limited instruments, scarce blood, no clean theater, and there was the moral and legal risk. Treating an enemy soldier could draw accusations, confiscation of supplies, or orders from command that contradicted what the oath demanded. The Geneva Convention was a paper line meant to protect those who tended the wounded, but on the ground the rules blurred under pressure and propaganda. Local commanders counted ration points, field officers noted prisoners as liabilities, and radio orders could arrive as cold directives that made saving a single life a choice against procedure. This is the tension Arthur and Colette faced in concentrated form. Duty as a medic versus duty to a campaign. The nurse wrapped a bandage with hands that had seen hunger and loss. The doctor checked pulse and pupil and measured the chance of survival with a steady private calculus. Oath over orders, mercy over propaganda. In that folded choice, a scalpel is more than a tool. It becomes a test of what a field hospital will allow itself to be when the world insists on choosing sides. They arrived with the dawn in a ragged line, 3 villagers carrying a stretcher between them, faces hollowed by the night. The pilot lay on the canvas, one sleeve torn to reveal a faded insignia and a white handkerchief clotted at the side of his waist. Mud stitched the hems of his flight jacket to his skin. Colette met them at the church door, lantern in one hand, the other steadying the stretcher as it bumped over the threshold. She pressed a palm to the man's forehead, felt fevered skin, and tucked a thin photograph back into the pocket where it had been bent. Someone muttered the word enemy, as if it were both accusation and excuse. Colette's reply was a whisper, not to them but to herself. "He breathes. That is enough." "Is he?" one villager began. "Alive," Colette said. "Bring him to the altar." They set him on the wooden table where a strapped blanket had been unfolded into a makeshift clinical surface. The scalpel lay beneath the gauze like a question. Arthur, who had slept fitfully and then without sleep at all, unwrapped it with fingers that were careful as if handling an oath. Outside, a distant rumble of shells threaded the morning. Inside, the church smelled now of boiled water, and the iron tang of pain controlled for a moment. Colette found an ampule, flicked the glass, and drew a measured dose of morphine into a small syringe. She handed it to Arthur. He hesitated, eyes moving over the man's face. Youth, a pale bruise around one eye, a cut at the lip. "Name?" Arthur asked in English. The pilot's lips made a sound that matched a name, but not English. Colette slid the photograph out and smoothed it over his chest like a talisman. The rescue scene carried with it the immediate calculus of life-saving. Stop active bleeding, relieve shock, and stabilize for movement. In field practice, the first minutes after arrival determine whether an injured person will survive evacuation. A stretcher brought from a cottage or a cart could be the difference between life and death, but it also cost time and drew attention. Helping hands from a village were often the first medical responders on the Western Front, improvising under fear and hunger. For Arthur and Colette, the presence of a wounded man in enemy garb complicated what should have been automatic. The Geneva Convention names the wounded as protected when tended, and the medic's oath pledged care to the injured irrespective of uniform. Yet local commanders measured every ration and counted every prisoner as a burden. The villagers' faces mirrored that tension, compassion embroidered with risk. Treating him now meant keeping him alive long enough to make the next decision, and that decision would not be purely medical. It would also be moral and military. Inside the church, assessment moved into triage with the mechanical calm of habit. Arthur checked airway, breathing, circulation. 3 words lived by medics: hands methodical, pulse at the wrist, listening to the chest, pupil response to light. Colette worked with a bandage roll, peeling away the crusted cloth to find the clean wound underneath. The cloth had served its purpose under a hedge. It had not stopped what lay deep within. "Abdomen entry here," Arthur announced, voice flat. "Possible internal bleeding." He scribbled a quick note on a scrap of paper to mark urgency and set the photo beside the casualty as a human anchor. The ampule of morphine had been administered to steady shock. The man's breaths slowed into a rhythm that suggested the drug was buying them minutes. "Can we operate?" Colette asked, the question stripped to its bone. Arthur's hand hovered near the scalpel. "If we don't, he won't make the convoy," he said. Triage in a field hospital is both technical and ethical. The technical side is straightforward. Treat those who can be saved with available resources, delay or palliate where survival is unlikely, but scarcity complicates the rule. A bandage or an ampule used on a single enemy might be one less for a comrade. A stretcher spent on an enemy might slow an evacuation. In formal doctrine, wounded combatants are to be treated without discrimination. In practice, medics balanced probability, resource allocation, and military orders. For Arthur, each decision had weight beyond the immediate patient. Ration lists, supply manifests, and the council of commanders. For Colette, who had watched families lose sons to both sides, the calculation had a human metric she was unwilling to ignore. The photograph on the man's chest, edges worn, a woman smiling, shifted the argument from abstraction to person. Triage here would not be a checklist alone. It would be a verdict on what kind of people the field hospital allowed itself to be. Preparing the church for surgery was an exercise in invention. The altar had become an operating table. A curtain was hung to obscure the work from the nave, but not from the eyes the volunteers always feared, those of a patrolling officer, a curious villager, a spy. Colette wound the crank of the hand lantern until the light stuttered with a steady glow. Its beam carved a small, honest circle over the pilot's abdomen. Arthur boiled instruments in an enamel pot, steam fogging the low vault, while the smell of boiled metal met the memory of antiseptic. There were no clamps of the kind in a proper theater. There was a sewing kit from a farmhouse, a length of linen that could be used to tie off vessels, and a syringe for morphine. Colette laid out the scalpel again, its edge refracting the lantern like a razor line of resolve. "We have no clamps," she said. "Then we make do," Arthur replied. "Sterilize the needle. Use the linen for a ligature." They set to work with the focused rhythm of people who have rehearsed improvisation more than they had expected to. Instruments were sterilized in boiling water, a simple but effective method to reduce infection when no autoclave existed. The team improvised by using a thick sewing needle as a makeshift trocar and a length of linen as a ligature to tie bleeding vessels. The bandage roll became both dressing and pad. One volunteer held a canteen from which they poured warm saline to irrigate the wound. Colette kept the morphine ampule at hand, watching the man's chest rise and fall, adjusting dosage in small, careful increments to keep him awake enough to breathe, but not in agony. Field surgery relies on controlling hemorrhage, preventing infection, and stabilizing the patient for possible evacuation. In this environment, the principles are the same as in any operating theater, but the tools are fewer and the margins narrower. Sterilization by boiling reduces bacterial load. Ligatures tie off vessels when clamps or cautery are unavailable. Packing the wound can temporarily control bleeding. These techniques are not substitutes for full surgical care, but they are life-saving in the immediate window. The choice to operate in the church, out of sight, and without a formal order to proceed, was therefore both a medical judgment and a moral act. Using scarce supplies on an enemy could be construed as insubordination. Failing to act would have been a breach of the medical vow. For Arthur, every improvised tool was a small, public rebellion on behalf of a single human life. When the incision was made, the room narrowed to the soundscape of the body and the instruments. Arthur worked with a clinician's focus, one hand steadying, the other moving with deliberate smallness. Colette passed instruments and held the lantern close enough to keep light where it was needed, and not so close that the pilot's pupils would constrict with glare. The bleeding source was tough, a vessel that had been nicked and was hiding beneath collapsed tissue. Arthur slid a needle threaded with suture through and tied a knot around the vessel, ligature, and the flow lessened. "Hold his hand," Arthur asked Colette, and she did, fingers warm and steady against the pilot's palm. For a moment he murmured a name that sounded like a sister's in German. Colette breathed the syllables like a promise. There are moments in surgery when a single knot decides a life, when technique replaces luck. In field conditions, the margin for error is smaller, the risk of infection higher, the chance of re-bleeding greater, the absence of blood banks a constant threat. Ligature, tying off a vessel, stays one of the oldest and most reliable methods to control bleeding when cautery or clips are not available. It is a small knot with outsized consequences. The decision to proceed into the abdominal cavity, where unseen damage could be fatal, was weighed against alternatives that were not truly alternatives. Wait for evacuation that might not come, or operate now with improvised tools. For the team, each stitch was a declaration about the kind of practice they would uphold amid orders and radioed priorities. The oath to do no harm had led them to act. Their hands, guided by training, bound what the war had sought to break. The hours that followed folded into watchful equilibrium. The pilot, stabilized, was moved onto a stretcher beneath a blanket. The photograph returned to a pocket like a small talisman. Colette sat beside him through the night, passing a canteen and a warmed spoon of broth when he could swallow. Arthur made rounds, checking temperature and pulse, listening to breath sounds that held more hope than they had in the morning. Outside, patrols still walked the hedgerows. Inside, the lantern light turned every face at the ward into a study in fatigue and concentration. Volunteers mended bandages and folded stretchers with the economy of people who knew tomorrow might demand all they had. At one point, a soldier from their own unit slipped into the nave, saw the pilot, and his jaw tightened. He left without a word. Colette placed the scalpel on the table, its handle smudged with antiseptic, and folded her hands as if in prayer. "Do you think they'll understand?" Arthur asked quietly. "They'll see a man alive," she said. "That is some answer. The night ward is where the human consequences of medical choices settle into longer threads. Recovery begins not only with a pulse and a closed wound, but with small acts of kindness. A cup given at dawn, a photograph smoothed, a name remembered. Nurses and medics in field hospitals often become the social scaffolding for the wounded, translating between language and trust, between fear and the steady measures of care. The Red Cross markings could make a tent a protected place on paper, yet the soft acts performed there, wrapping a blanket, replacing a bandage, are what enforce protection in practice. For Colette and Arthur, the vigil carried both solace and the gnawing knowledge of potential reprisal. Their hands had made a life. Their chain of command might demand an explanation steeped in logistics and law. Yet in the quiet, with the pilot's breathing slowing to a hopeful rhythm, the immediate truth was simple. A human had been saved because other humans had chosen to keep him so. Dawn brought a new sound, measured boots on the lane and voices, then the knock that had come in the night, firmer now and official. An officer stood at the nave, eyes taking in the altar-turned ward. Behind him, a small patrol waited like a punctuation. He asked for the duty officer and for records. Colette stepped forward, wristband tucked into sight, face calm. Arthur wrapped a spare bandage around his own palm, as if preparing to sign a ledger of consequence. The officer's questions arrived clipped. Who was this man? Where had you found him? Why was a German still alive in an Allied field hospital? The answers were uncomplicated fact. Found in a field, brought by villagers, treated for internal bleeding, stabilized. Yet the tone suggested accusation more than curiosity. "You know the orders," the officer said finally. "Prisoners are to be reported at once. Supplies are allotted for our men. There are rules." Arthur met his gaze and did something that had not been rehearsed. He did not argue logistics. He did not hide the photograph or the morphine ampule. He put his hands on the table and told the truth. "He was dying," Arthur said. "We could not let him die. He is alive now." The confrontation that follows a clandestine act of care often determines whether mercy is punished or understood. Military regulations can be inflexible. Command may view an alive enemy as a strategic asset or a liability depending on transport and intelligence priorities. There is also, however, the practical recognition that medics, by training and oath, extend care without asking the injured their politics. The officer could have read the wound list and radioed for a tally, or he could have escalated the matter to court-martial. He chose instead a procedural solution. The pilot would be taken into custody, and the field hospital would document its interventions. Arthur offered a terse account, taking responsibility not as defiance, but as professional duty. By admitting what they had done, they framed the act as medical necessity rather than subversion. The pilot, alert enough to understand, looked at Arthur and Colette with something like fragile gratitude. The photograph was folded and returned to him, fingers closing around it as if touching kin across language. In those 6 blocks, rescue, triage, preparation, operation, vigil, and confrontation, the choices of Dr. Arthur and Colette were not isolated incidents, but parts of a single moral arc. Each scene moved from immediate gesture to a broader ethical knot. An instrument laid down became a symbol. A photograph warmed a human face into an individual rather than an emblem. A knot in a suture translated into a stance about whose lives would be protected. The practical realities of field medicine: sterilization by boiling, ligature to stop bleeding, morphine to treat shock, sat alongside quieter obligations: to honor the oath, to tend the dying, to hold the fragile line of civilization within the chaos. Their decisions consumed scarce supplies and risked disciplinary action, but they kept the idea of a hospital intact, a place where the dying, regardless of flag, are patients first. Their decisions consumed scarce supplies and attention, and the ripple reached further into the small hospital than anyone first admitted. Mid-morning, as the pilot lay folded into a blanket under a dim skylight, a cart creaked up with other casualties. 2 infantrymen with shrapnel in a leg, and a boy barely 20 with a ragged wound to his shoulder. A corporal hustled in, breathless and anxious. "We lost 3 men in the hedgerow," he said. "They need dressings and a stretcher." He set a small ledger on the altar and tapped a line marked "Bandage Roll, 5." Volunteers immediately counted what remained. 3 full rolls, 2 half-used. A young nurse pointed to the pilot and then to the ledger, the question heavy in the air without words. "We cannot turn them away," Colette said quietly, and she began to tear a clean strip from a larger roll. Arthur moved between the patients like a balancing scale, checking pulses and the depth of bleeding, prioritizing. He chose the boy's shoulder as delayed but salvageable, the shrapnel to the leg as immediate due to compromised arteries, and the pilot as in the urgent category because of the risk of abdominal hemorrhage despite the temporary hemostasis they had achieved. He called for a stretcher and assigned 2 volunteers to prepare it. The ledger was updated, supplies marked, names entered. Outside, someone chalked the arrival on a fence, another tally against an already thin stockpile. Triage in this context became a ledger of moral claim as much as medical need. Every roll of bandage or ampule of morphine recorded in the book carried an ethical tally, which life would receive a scarce resource now and which would wait. Medics rely on categories: immediate, delayed, minimal, expectant, to allocate care. In a mass-wounded environment, those categories reduce suffering most efficiently. But in a small field hospital with limited supplies and no guaranteed convoy, these categories also become moral statements. That paddle of numbers on the altar's ledger was not only accounting, it was a record of choices that named who was prioritized by humanity at that moment. Treating an enemy soldier alongside one's own forced staff to balance professional impartiality against a raw sense of collective survival. The act of writing a name in the book, crossing off a bandage, became an act of ethical responsibility. The priest who kept the church offered quiet assistance, opening a side room to store linens and bringing hot water in a chipped kettle. He moved among the wounded like a quiet node, and villagers brought what food they could spare: stale bread, a pot of watered soup. One woman, who'd watched Colette treat her son a week earlier, pressed a small tin into Colette's hand. "For the one with the photo," she said in halting English. The woman's small act was not political. It was gratitude converted into sustenance. Colette accepted it, folded the tin away, and later warmed the pilot's hands on the lid. Community support often determined survival as much as surgical skill in these isolated posts. Villagers were first responders and providers of material help. Their willingness to risk transport or to hide a man in a cart could mean life or death. That same community, however, lived under the constant calculation of danger. Collaborating with any side invited suspicion and retribution. For the medics, accepting a woman's pot or a man's blanket was a recognition of a mutual stake in survival. Caring for an enemy man required the tacit cooperation of neighbors who might face consequences if their role became known. These small acts, food, linens, a whispered watch, expanded the definition of a field hospital to include kinship ties that transcended uniforms. Word of the pilot's presence moved slowly along hedgerows and lanes. At midday, a courier from a forward intelligence post arrived, hair damp with sweat, bearing a short, crisp memo. "Enemy officer captured. Report immediate." He asked to see the patient and to make notes. Arthur, who had reviewed the man's wounds and had written on the ledger, felt the old knot of responsibility tighten. The courier's questions were efficient, free of the human cadence that had softened others' approaches. He noted the insignia, the approximate time of rescue, and then looked to Colette as if expecting a moral justification. "Why was he not turned over sooner?" the courier asked. Colette, hands still warm from working in the morning, met him without deflection. "He would not have survived the wait," she said. The courier, trained to parse advantage, left the scene with a clipped nod, his pen already on the next page. His memo would travel the chain of command and create a new layer of scrutiny. The presence of a captured enemy in Allied custody was not only a medical matter, It was an intelligence question and a logistical consideration. If the pilot carried information worth interrogation, securing his health became an operational priority. But until that question was asked, the medical decision to save him remained the only moral certitude in the room. Intelligence priorities can transform a bedside into a tactical asset overnight. A medic's act of saving an enemy can be reframed as service to one's own side if the captured individual carries useful information. Conversely, it can become a bureaucratic complication when transport, guard allocation, and interrogation resources must be diverted. For Arthur, this reframing was ambivalent. If the pilot's survival yielded intelligence that helped their side, the cost of scarce supplies would be justified in strategic terms. Yet the paradox remained. The choice to save had preceded any calculation of value. The act began with a hand on a wound, not a view through files. The courier's arrival made explicit attention always latent in the field hospital. Medicine could be instrumentalized by command, converting mercy into a practical asset without changing its moral source. As afternoon wore on, the pilot's breathing improved incrementally. He woke once, blinking slowly in the lantern light, and when he could move his fingers, he found the photograph and held it like a fragile currency. Colette sat with him, while a translator from a nearby town tried to build simple sentences. The translator's English was rusty. Their shared attempts at conversation were halting, but the pilot managed to form a phrase. Meine Schwester. He touched his chest, and then the photograph. The word landed in the room like a private invocation that needed no translation. Colette sat and listened, letting the gentleness of attention be its own small medicine. Language and attention play central roles in the ward's healing. A wounded person who can name a kin or recall a memory anchors himself to a sense of continuity that medicine alone cannot supply. Medical interventions, stitches, dressings, morphine, stabilize bodies. The human voice helps anchor patients to identity, to a social world beyond the immediate crisis. For someone who had fallen behind enemy lines, the memory of a sister or a town or a simple domestic image could be the difference between folding into despair and clinging to the will to live. Colette's patience and the pilot's small, repeated invocation of his sister functioned as a human triage, restoring not only circulation, but personhood. Night brought another strain on resources. A supply truck failed to arrive. Its tires punctured, its journey delayed by shelling on a nearby road. Men at the field station radioed back that replacements would be late, perhaps a day. That news moved through the hospital like a slow exhale. Someone counted morphine ampules. 2 remained unopened. The bandage roll tally showed fewer than 20 complete wraps left for that night. Colette and Arthur convened a quiet meeting by the altar with 2 other medics. They debated protocols and improvised rationing plans. "What if we reroute the convoy and take him?" one medic suggested. "If he's valuable, headquarters will allocate transport." "It's not that simple," Arthur answered. "We don't know he's valuable, and we'll lose the chance to stabilize our own if we shoulder him on a stretcher and slow the convoy. Besides, movement risks bleeding." Colette, fingers still stained from the day's work, shook her head. "We've already used what we could. We keep him here, and we make him as stable as we can. If transport arrives, we transfer. If not, we offset supplies by calling for help from neighboring posts and the villages." Resource constraints force the redefinition of triage into longer-term stewardship. Medics must decide not only who to treat now, but how to ensure those treatments suffice until reinforcements arrive. Moving a patient has risks: bleeding, exposure, shock, and sometimes remaining stationary with steady care yields better prospects. The calculation includes predictions about supply lines and the pace of military movements, data that medics may not reliably possess. Hence the need for local networks and improvisation, calling on neighboring posts, leveraging the goodwill of civilians, and conserving critical items like morphine by using non-pharmacologic measures when possible. The decision to keep the pilot at the church reflected that pragmatic stewardship and the belief that continued local care could carry the patient until official systems could be engaged. The possibility of reprisal still loomed. In the early hours of the next morning, a sergeant from the captain's company arrived, face creased with the kind of worry that looked like anger. He demanded the names of everyone who had worked on the pilot and asked pointedly if anyone had used supplies beyond their authorization. He held a small ledger himself and pointed to entries they had written. "You understand the supply situation," he said. "You understand command will not tolerate misuse." Arthur could have diffused the encounter with technical jargon about triage classifications and necessity. Instead, he looked at the sergeant and answered plainly. "We used what was necessary to stop him dying," he said. "If that is misuse, then we misused it in the name of a life." The sergeant's jaw tightened, then softened for a single beat when he saw the pilot's breathing measured on the watch. He made no promise of protection. He left with the same ledger and the same set of questions, but he did not order a court-martial. The specter of discipline is a real deterrent in military medicine. Command structures depend on predictability of supply and compliance with orders. An unauthorized use of resources can be framed as insubordination. Yet, there is a countervailing ethic. Medics who withhold care out of fear of reprimand betray the fundamental duty of their profession. The sergeant's visit exemplified the institutional tension between control and care. Arthur's straightforward answer reframed the issue. The ledger and the supplies were secondary to the life they had in front of them. Such a stance risks reprimand, but also reasserts the professional claim that medicine answers first to the sick and injured, not to administrative convenience. Meanwhile, in a quieter corner of the church, Colette kept a small watch of the pilot's personal effects. A looping thread in the photograph's corner matched a faint pattern embroidered onto the inside of his jacket. She smoothed the image and, in a gesture that was more ritual than utility, tied a strip of bandage to the corner of the photograph. It was something she had seen her grandmother do when sailors left, a token to remind those who stayed that someone would wait. The pilot opened his eyes and found her fingers at the image, tracing the loop of her knot with a heavy fingertip. He smiled without sound, and in returning the gesture, made them both participants in a tiny, cross-language covenant. Small rituals sustain relationships in war zones. A tied corner of a photograph, a folded blanket, a whispered name. These are markers of continuity, ways of saying to a wounded person that they are more than a casualty, that they are known and will be remembered. For medics, engaging in these rituals is not extra work. It is part of the healing environment, building trust that improves cooperation and therefore outcomes. Colette's knot was an exercise in preserving personhood amid procedures, and it gave both patient and caregiver a shared human touchpoint. Days passed. An interrogator arrived with a civilian translator and a notebook, and the pilot was asked questions while still under watch. His answers were cautious. He named a base far behind the front, and spoke of a mission interrupted by anti-aircraft fire. Intelligence men noted details and cross-correlated with raid reports. The pilot's survival became, for them, a data point of potential strategic value. Arthur watched these proceedings with a quiet unease. The pilot, once stabilized, was no longer solely a medical responsibility. The man's life had been converted into intelligence material, and hospital staff felt the shift. The translation of a life into a tactical asset was not always comfortable for medics who had tended wounds without preconception. The conversion of patients into sources is a recurring moral dissonance for wartime medics. On paper, preserved health is a resource for the state. In bedside terms, a person is a life with a network of waiting friends and kin. Medics can find themselves co-opted into intelligence workflows, required to hand over not only bodies, but the narratives that ground them. For Arthur and Colette, the task was to provide accurate accounts of care while protecting their patients' dignity. They documented procedures, dosages of morphine, and times of intervention in the ledger, as required, but resisted any overreach that would strip the pilot of his personhood. A medical record, they believed, should be a neutral truth, not an instrument for dehumanization. As the pilot improved, rumors reached the ward. A convoy might pass later that week with space for prisoners. The logistics of movement were complex, routes were dangerous, fuel was rationed, and every additional stretcher could slow the convoy and increase risk for all. Planning for transport became a matter of negotiation. Arthur wrote an honest report and prepared the pilot for transfer, knowing that handing him over under Allied custody was the likely outcome. The decision felt like surrender to the system they had partly resisted, but also like a concession to the practical realities of war. Mercy had been exercised. Now it would be folded into procedure. Transfer day arrived in rain. A transport lorry rolled up, sides masked and guards in tow. The pilot was helped onto a stretcher, his photograph again tucked into an inside pocket. Colette and Arthur stood to one side as a sergeant took down signatures and noted the patient's stable vitals. The pilot looked at them with an expression that translated across language. Thanks, and an inkling of fear. He was not informed about his final destination. He did not need to be. Colette slid the bandaged corner of the photograph into his palm. "Stay," she said in French, which he did not understand, but the tone carried the same clarity as any medical order. The handover of a patient is a ritual of trust and relinquishment. For medics, it is the moment when intervention passes to others and the direct stewardship ends. Properly executed, a handover includes a complete record of procedures, medications, and status. Improperly handled, it can endanger the patient. In the field, handovers are vulnerable to delays and miscommunication. Security concerns complicate transparency. Arthur's documentation and Colette's small gestures were their last acts of bedside care, ensuring that the pilot moved forward with a tangible and recorded tether to the people who had kept him alive. When the lorry pulled away, the church seemed oddly hollowed. Volunteers resumed other duties. The ledger was closed for that patient, and the bandage inventory updated. There was a private relief in the room. Some weight had been lifted, but also a residual unease. Had they done enough? Had their acts exposed them to later questioning? The sergeant who oversaw the transfer offered a curt nod, but no praise. The pilot's stretcher disappeared through the church gate and down the lane, and the war resumed its indifferent clatter. The aftermath of such decisions lingers. Medical staff often return to routine tasks, suturing another wound, inserting IVs, checking fever charts. But the moral effects take longer to resolve. Staff members replay choices, weighing alternatives and imagining other outcomes. For Arthur, gratitude and fear mixed. He was proud of the skill that had saved a life, but conscious that the ledger might one day be used against him. Colette, who had seen many choices made in defiance of orders, tucked the photograph in her apron and walked out to check on a neighbor's child. Their small, quiet acts persist as measures of a collective conscience, even when official reports reduce them to lines on a page. Weeks later, news filtered back that the pilot had been processed through detention and later exchanged in a prisoner swap. The confirmation arrived as a terse memo and a handful of photographs of other returned men. For the medics who had labored through that night and the days after, the news was not a prosecution or a reward. It was a kind of receipt that affirmed the original act. A life had been saved and returned, and in that return was proof that mercy had delayed only long enough for a greater system to reassert itself. The ledger remained on the altar, its ink faded in places, but legible. Names, times, doses, a small archive of human decisions made under pressure. Saving an enemy soldier in a field hospital rarely produces straightforward outcomes. Sometimes the rescue feeds into intelligence operations that help an entire campaign. Sometimes it leads to disciplinary proceedings. Sometimes it produces nothing more than a life continued and a family spared. For Arthur and Colette, the event became a lesson in the practicalities of their oath. That medicine is ideally blind to politics, but in practice must navigate politics with both honesty and courage. The nurse and the doctor had acted because the immediate human need demanded it. They recorded the act because fidelity to truth protects both patient and practitioner. Their work affirmed a central claim of wartime medicine. Mercy is not an abstract virtue, but a set of practices, instruments sterilized in boiling pots, ligatures knotted in dim light, morphine measured to soothe shock. Each action was technical, but the cumulative choice to help an enemy underscored a moral principle that would outlast any single patrol report.